Calls of the Castle, Part 1, written by Rick and Disgusting. I grew up hearing stories about the castle high up in the mountains. It was said that the wind is always blowing fiercely up there, that if you listen carefully, you can hear it carry whispers that will try to lure you into the castle, and those who enter the castle never come out again. I always thought that it was a load of crap, that it was the story that parents told their children so that they wouldn't play in the woods and get lost. Children played the game nonetheless, but they stopped when Peter Lewinsky disappeared, my sister's boyfriend. Since then, no one has dared to go up into the mountain again. No one except for me. The idea came to me on a boring winter afternoon when I was sitting in class in senior high. My friends and I were at the age where you're not just bored at school, you're bored everywhere. The age where you're constantly looking for a cheap thrill, dying to feel alive as the normality of structure just isn't intense enough. I was sitting next to my friend Kane, and my best friend Ryan was sitting in front of us. She was backwards on her chair with her head resting on my desk. Her golden locks were draped over my science books. Kane was next to me, frantically scribbling in his notebook, trying to keep up with whatever Mr. Rubinson was going on about. As Mr. Rubinson was droning on about upcoming exams, Ryan let out a huge sigh. I hate sitting still for this long. Is it almost the fourth period yet? She said, looking up at me. Fourth period meant PE, and PE meant that Ryan was in her element. She played about every sport available in our small school, and was in the top of all of her teams. When she wasn't busy practicing and winning tournaments, she could be found at the local skate park perfecting her latest trick. This week it was the Nollie 720 Gazelle nerd flip, she told me, whatever that was. Yeah, almost 20 minutes more, I told her. She groaned and plopped her head back into her arms. I chuckled. You got this. It'll be over before you know it, I assured her as I patted her head over her baseball cap. Ryan and I had met in kindergarten and had been inseparable ever since. When we were in middle school, we got into Jackass, watching reruns on TV every day after class. The fact that we were told to not try this at home didn't stop us from doing crazy stuff. Slowly but surely, we had gotten the friends that we had made over the years to join in as well. Stealing shopping carts and racing each other downhill. Jumping off the bridge that separated our town from the rest of civilization into freezing cold midwinter water. If it was crazy, we did it, you name it. Kay, can you let me borrow your notes later? Ryan asked the boy to my right without looking up. Well, if you paid attention, you wouldn't have to, Kane smirked. She replied by repeating what he had said in a mocking tone and then blowing raspberries at the end. I couldn't keep myself from laughing a little too hard. Mr. Rubinson looked over with a tired expression. If you guys aren't going to pay attention, you might as well not be here, he sighed. Ryan finally came to life and whipped around. Does that mean we can go? She asked excitedly. Sure, if you want attention, Mr. Rubinson retorted in his signature monotone voice. Ryan's happy expression faded instantly as she dropped her head into her palm and let out a grunt. As I was staring out of the window, letting Mr. Rubinson's voice fade into the background, I got lost in thought. I thought about my sister and what had happened that day. Ashley wasn't the same ever since she'd played the game. She was barely able to talk anymore when she made it back, much less tell us what had happened at the castle. After that day, she dropped out of school and locked herself in her room, doing nothing but lay in bed and staring at the ceiling all day. Ashley killed herself that same month. At the time, I didn't understand. She used to be outgoing and driven and creative. I just couldn't wrap my young mind around what could have possibly been so traumatizing that it made her take her own life. Based on what I know now, I think she made the most logical decision. My parents didn't know much more than I did. Whenever I asked them about my sister, all they would tell me was that you were never, ever to go to the castle. But I don't have to explain to you what happens when you tell a teenager not to do something. I had to find out what had happened to her myself. After watching from the bench as Ryan bounced around the room with a basketball during PE for an hour, I had had enough time to let the idea mull over in my head. It was during lunch that I threw it out there. I was walking with Ryan and Kane to our usual table, where our friend Susie was already seated. "Susie!" Kane exclaimed as he ran up to her and plopped down next to her. He threw his arms around Susie and gave her a peck on the cheek. "Hey guys," Susie responded by grinning and hugging him back. Susie's full name was actually Suzuki Miyano. A few years back, her dad had moved to the US for work with her and her mom. Ever since middle school, Suzuki had gone by Susie instead. I don't think that I have to explain why. Kids can be real assholes sometime. Right then, Dakota walked up and threw his tray onto the table before sinking down in his chair. He greeted us by letting out a long, dramatic sigh before going on. "I can't imagine your morning being any more dull than mine," he said. "Try me," Ryan replied while trying to steal a fry off his plate. "English from Mrs. Benton," he explained while smacking her hand away. "Strong contender. However, science from Mr. Rubinson," Ryan countered. "Fine, you win," Dakota admitted while shooting her a fake smile. As everyone was focused on their meal, I took a chance to offer up my idea. "Hey guys, remember that game that everyone used to play?" "You gotta be a little more specific, buddy," Ryan told me, her face stuffed with spaghetti. "Well, the calls of the castle," I said. That caught everyone's attention. How could we forget? Dakota laughed nervously. "That's how Peter Lewinsky died, right?" Susie added. "Disappeared," Kane corrected her. "We don't know for sure what happened." "And Ash," Ryan brought up carefully. For a second, everyone was quiet. "I want to play," I shared solemnly. I was met with looks of bewilderment. "Are you crazy?" Kane laughed. "I don't think that that's the best idea, Gabe," Susie brought up. Ryan just eyed me with a stern look on her face, waiting for me to go on. "I want to find out what really happened to my sister at that," I told them before I added. "And you have to admit we're all bored around here." "And how will playing a game help?" Susie asked. "I hope to find out once we get there," I told her. "Gabe, you don't really think that castle actually had anything to do with what happened, right?" Kane asked. "Remember what the doctor said about your sister probably being in a psychosis from taking some bad drugs?" "Yeah, but they never actually found anything. And that doesn't explain what happened to Peter," I countered. "Never mind them." Dakota sat back in his chair before folding his arms and legs. "Count me in, Gabriel. I think it'll be very interesting." "Right. Remember last week when we went to that abandoned building in the woods and wrecked it? That was fun. Come on, have I ever let you down?" I said. Kane contemplated it for a second. "You know, what the heck? What's the worst that could possibly happen, right?" He looked to Susie. "Only if you come with." "I don't know," Susie began. "Come on, Susie," Kane whined while holding her shoulders and rocking her back and forth. Her concerned expression melted. All right. I'll think about it, okay?" She grinned. "Yay!" Kane exclaimed. I met Ryan's eyes. She looked at me as if to say, "Are you sure about this?" I held her gaze and gave her a solemn nod. She nodded back, but didn't look quite so convinced yet. "Well, that settles it then. I guess someone has to fill in Scooter. That guy's always up for doing weird stuff." Dakota said as he got up and picked up his tray. "Someone other than me. Bye." He waved and strutted off. Right, Scooter. I never actually knew his real name. If he had one, that is. He was always holed up in his room, only leaving the house when we invited him to hang out. Back then, I didn't understand why he got to class late and skipped school all the time. Right now, I couldn't relate to him more. "I'll drop by his house after school," I offered. And so I did. After the sound of the last bell, I headed to his apartment. He lived in a tiny space in the biggest and only complex in town. The complex lay near the outskirts of town, but it was well within walking distance. Everything was within walking distance. That's how small our town was, but we still had everything that we needed to be self-sufficient. About 10 minutes later, I arrived at the main entrance and rang the bell to his apartment. His mom's voice sounded welcoming over the intercom. Mrs. Sullivan was always so happy when we visited, grateful for getting her son to go outside. After I made it to the 6th floor, the door swung open before I could knock. "Gabriel, come in quickly. It's way too cold outside," Mrs. Sullivan greeted while imitating a shiver. I greeted her and took off my shoes and coat and placed them between the neatly stacked rows as to not mess up Mrs. Sullivan's system. She was there, always, whenever I came to pick up Scooter. I always wondered if she didn't have a job to be at. Looking back now, she was probably there to keep an eye on Scooter. "Scooter's in his room. Go ahead, honey. You know where to find him. I'll bring you some tea and freshly baked cookies in a minute." I thanked her before heading to Scooter's room, which was easy to identify by the large pentagram on the door. I knocked twice and headed in. Scooter was sprawled out on his bed, laying on his stomach, poring over a book. The drawn curtains let in thin strips of light in his otherwise dark room. The walls of Scooter's room were lined with posters of bands that I'd never heard of, and the floor was filled with clothes and dirty dishes. His was the only room in the tiny apartment which wasn't squeaky clean. He turned around at the sound of me almost tripping over his underwear and sat up. "Oh, what's up, bro?" he greeted with a tired expression. "Hey man," I said as I positioned myself next to him. "How are you holding up?" Same old. You know how it goes," he replied in his slow voice. "How was school?" "Mr. Rubinson," I explained. He gave me a comforting pat on the shoulder. "We came up with a new quest, though. You ready?" Scooter sat up straighter at my words and a twinkle appeared in his tired eyes. "We're going to play Calls of the Castle." His expression was hard to read. It appeared to be a mixture of excitement, fear, and doubt, but the twinkle very much remained. "Are you in?" I continued. The look in his eyes changed to one of determination. "You know I am, bro," he said as he gave me a tired smile. And that was that. I had convinced all my friends to join me in what would be our last big adventure together. That Saturday, all of us gathered at Dakota's place since his parents were out of town. Since everyone had shown up and had gotten comfortable on his huge sofa, I stood up to explain the rules. It's really simple. We hike up the mountain until we reach the castle. Once we arrive, we sit around in a circle in front of the gates and join hands. We have to close our eyes and focus on the wind. "Focus on the wind?" Ryan interrupted. "Yes, listening to if you hear anything, I guess." I continued. "Then we wait for exactly 7 minutes and 6 seconds exactly before opening our eyes again. By now, one of us should have been called into the castle, so to speak, and gone through the gates. That means that when one of us opens their eyes, they will suddenly be in the castle." I heard Kane scoff at this, but I continued nevertheless. "If you're the one who wakes up in the castle, it's very important that you don't move from your spot and don't let us know where you are. Stay there until the rest of us find you. We have 1 hour, 6 minutes, and 6 seconds to do so. I was met with looks of excitement and anxiety. How do you know all of this? Susie asked in amazement. My sister explained it to me before she went and played the game, I explained. What happens when we don't find them in time? Ryan asked. I have no idea, but an hour is probably more than enough time, so I wouldn't worry about it, I answered nonchalantly. How do we even decide which one of us enters the castle? Kane laughed. We don't. The castle decides it for us, I guess. I responded, now laughing a little at myself at how insane it actually sounded. Everyone started talking at once, voicing their opinions about how much they thought the game was BS. Dakota stood up next to me and stopped them in their tracks. Guys, let's just go and see what happens, yeah? He said as he held up his hands. It's not like we have something better to do today. I mean, no one could argue with that. So on our way we went. It was a short walk to the edge of the forest, but we still had a long hike up to the top of the mountain. Dakota marched ahead, followed by me and Ryan. Kane and Susie walked behind us, and Scooter walked by himself in the back. I overheard Kane mocking Susie as he noticed her struggling with her backpack. Susie, what did you bring? You look like you're going on a vacation, he joked. You know, just the essentials, she replied, laughing while clutching her backpack by its straps and hoisting it up every few seconds. What, to survive for a month in the woods? Kane mocked. Shut up, she said as she punched his arm playfully. You never know when you might need a sketch pad or a good book. All it took was one of Kane's looks to make Susie tell him to shut up again. The whole trip went on like that, with everyone goofing off, not knowing what awaited us up at the castle. It took us 2 hours total, with a few rest stops in between, to make it up the hill. The further we walked, the colder it got. Once the castle came into view, the wind picked up and violently blew us back and forth. We had to raise our voices to be able to hear each other. Wow, you weren't kidding about the wind, Ryan yelled. The castle seemed smaller than anticipated. The eroded structure stood in the middle of an open field with the ground it stood on bare and muddy. The castle itself consisted of a short flat structure with 2 towers on the right side. The left side was elevated with 2 more towers attached to it. This is kind of disappointing, Dakota huffed. Well, at least it'll be easy to find each other in there, Ryan brought up. Let's hope so, Kane replied. We walked closer to the castle and stopped a few feet from the front gates. So, we just sit down here? Susie asked. Before she could finish her sentence, Kane plopped down on the dirt. Let's do this, I'm excited, he squealed. I sat down on his left. Ryan sat down next to me. Scooter next to her, followed by Susie, who threw down her backpack and sat down next to Kane. Dakota lowered himself between Susie and Scooter and completed the circle. Who's gonna set a timer? I asked. I'll do it, hang on, Dakota offered as he took out his phone. 7 minutes and 6 seconds, right? Yes, it has to be that exact, I replied. Kane grabbed my hand and I grabbed Ryan's. The rest followed suit until all of us were interlinked. Except for Dakota, who was still fumbling around with his phone. Once the timer stops, we have to close our eyes and be completely silent. You can't open your eyes or speak before the timer goes off, I instructed. Dakota put down his phone in the middle of the circle, and so it began. I felt a change in the atmosphere. The seriousness of the situation seemed to have overtaken our giddy mood. Those 7 minutes felt like 7 hours. I felt Ryan squeeze my hand reassuringly. I tried to focus on the wind and see if I could hear anything out of the ordinary. But all I heard was the creak of dead branches and the rustling of leaves. All the while, I didn't hear anyone get up or feel anyone let go of my hand. I was afraid that it hadn't worked until the timer went off. I opened my eyes and suddenly found that I was now holding Susie's hand. I looked around and I saw that all of us were still there, except for Kane.